The only churches that I know of that had the two largest food pantries in the Treasure Valley were Foothills Christian Church and the Vineyard. And they work closely side by side. The food pantry at Foothills Christian Church is still very active, and it's blowing and going. Which, by the way, the group of people that tried to blow the church up and hurt it had no regard for Matthew chapter 25 and the ministry of the church to people who are hungry. And I'm curious what they're going to say when they stand before Jesus and they're going to say, well, our petty agenda was more important than the actual calling for the church. Well, that's a salty thing to say, isn't it? Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Salty Pastor Podcast. Today, where did all this gender confusion insanity come from? I mean, how in the world did we go from just a decade ago in 2015 where things like same-sex marriage, homosexual expression, gender was all pretty much settled. And then now, just 10 years later, we are allowing minors to participate in the mutilation of their own bodies because of their gender dysphoria. How in the world did we get there? And what in the world does that have to do with one of the rules for life in the book of Galatians? I am your salty pastor, and I'm here to give you the unfiltered truth of what the Bible actually says and means, and then help you apply it to your life. I'm not going to do that for you. My goal is to help you think for yourself because I want to coach you in your own faith. When you take the responsibility for your own faith, just like taking responsibility for your life, that's when you really start living. That's where you start to have a sense that your life has value. Value doesn't come in life from being told that you have value. It comes when you experience personal growth, particularly spiritual growth, and the thirst of your soul starts to get quenched. That's when you start to feel value in your life. And so I'm here to help every person out there who wants to grow in their faith and they want to pursue it on their own path or pattern or process. And they want to not be told what to do or what to think, but they want to discover an authentic relationship with Jesus Christ and what he and his Holy Spirit wants to do in them and through them. So I am not trying to be a middleman. I'm not trying to be a church pastor that is trying to build something. I'm just simply here to help you as an individual grow in your faith. So I am here for anybody and everybody. If you're a part of a church, but you think fluff is not enough and you want to go deeper into your faith, Salty Pastor is for you. If you're in between churches, if you feel like, wow, I can't really do the current pattern of church here in America, that's okay because I am here. You're not alone. You're not on your own, and you can do some dynamic things in your faith when you intentionally want to grow it. So that's why the Salty Pastor is here. Help you get coached up in your faith. Now, we're currently studying the book of Galatians, and we're looking at the 7 rules of life that he gives. These are biblical principles that you can apply to your life right now. Now, if you remember, the book of Galatians was a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote. If you're just starting out in faith, read the book of Luke and then read the book of Acts. And then everything else in the Bible, all these other books, suddenly make sense. Oh, that's why this book was written and it's in the New Testament and so forth. So in the book of Acts, Paul went around, planted a bunch of churches. He planted some churches in the region of Galatia, and now he's writing them a letter because some people went and disrupted their faith, and some of these people are actually abandoning biblical Christianity. And Paul says, don't do that. What were they abandoning it for? Well, they were believing that they needed to start following the Old Testament Mosaic law and convert to Judaism. Why were they thinking this? Well, because there was a group of people that had followed after Paul. They said that they were followers of Christ, but they were also Jewish. And they said, well, in order to follow Jesus, you have to be Jewish as well. And Paul says, nope, you don't. And that's why he wrote this letter. And in this letter, as he argues about why you don't have to be Jewish to follow Jesus, is these profound 7 laws. And the first one is this: never forget your purpose. You have a purpose in life. You are separated from God, and Jesus came in order to bring you back to God by paying for your debt of sin on the cross. There you go. It's that simple. God did this because he loves you, and you were created to be in relationship with him. And until you know God through Jesus Christ, you're never going to be satisfied in this life, and it kind of messes up your eternity as well. Number 2, the world hates this idea. Don't allow the world to influence your faith or be conformed to this world. So he makes this argument that this group of people are coming in and they're trying to use their faith against them to get them to adopt worldly ideas, like you better become Jewish if you want to be a real Christian. And we see this all the time today. People say, well, you're not a Christian unless you vote this way. You're not a Christian unless you feel this way or think this way. And I find it how odd these things are always political in nature. And they always seem to be progressively leftist ideas, Marxist ideas, socialist and communist ideas. And this guilt approach shows you the delusion in their position. They're trying to get you, based on your faith, to adopt a political, socialist, communist ideology by saying you don't care for people. This is simply a faith based on works. And we all know you can't work your way into salvation. Number 3, discover and know the most important truth of all. And so we talked about how Paul stood up to the Apostle Peter in the church of Antioch before he went and planted the churches in Galatia, and how he publicly stood up to the Apostle Peter's hypocrisy. And that is, you have to know the most important truths, the big truths, and then you got to throw a stake in the ground and say, I am not moving. Finally, we talked on Tuesday in chapter 3 about you have to choose the foundation of what makes your life right, or what gives you righteousness. Another way to say it is, what is the basis for who you are? In other words, what is it that makes you you? Now, in Galatians 3, Paul lays out that our identity doesn't come from following the Mosaic law or becoming Jewish or trying to do more. He says that's not where your identity comes from. He says your identity comes from Jesus through faith. And he says it's what you believe about Jesus that makes the difference. And he gives examples of Abraham and how Abraham was given a promise or a covenant from God, and that the way Abraham was reckoned righteousness was not because he followed the law, because the law didn't come until 430 years later. It was because he had faith. And so in the same way, he says at the end of chapter 3, he says, for we are all sons of God through faith in Jesus Christ. So that's how we come to know. And he says, when we believed, that's when we became a part of God's family and the promise that God gave to Abraham. So we are now considered Abraham's offspring. Side note, did you know that Islam traces its heritage back through Ishmael, the son of Abraham? And so Abraham is the father of their belief system, they claim. Judaism claims Abraham as the father of their belief system. And then guess what? Christianity, Paul makes the argument that Jesus is the seed promised to Abraham, and it is our belief that we are now part of we have the promise of God to Abraham. Isn't that interesting? How every major religion out there that's monotheistic claims Abraham. Abraham must have been some dude. Let me tell you what's going on. The father of so much. And to think that he started out childless. Now, why is this such a significant thing? Because what we're talking about here is identity. And identity is that core belief you have that gives your life value. Your identity is what makes you you. And what's interesting, you can influence your identity. Your belief has a huge, what you choose to believe, impact on your identity. And I want you to know in this, the rest of this podcast, we're going to talk about how the world really dislikes this and is doing everything it can to stop people from finding their true identity in Christ, because they see Jesus and his philosophy as somehow a hindrance to their political goals. The world is going to stand against your capacity to build your identity, your value, your self-worth, your direction in life from Jesus and what he says about you. The biggest place that this comes up is in gender ideology. And what a lot of people don't understand is that gender ideology, gender dysphoria, comes from an argument that says sex, meaning the biological chromosomes, male and female, are separate from gender identity and gender roles. Now, the reason they do this is because of Marxist ideology. It comes right out of the whole notion of the hierarchy of oppressed and oppressor based on minority status, whether you're a man or a woman, what color you are, what language you speak. And so this is basic Marxist philosophy. And so they applied it to that, and they said, look, gender is simply a socio-constructed role. Now, of course, this is pure silliness because most of our socio-constructed roles are simply a recognition of reality, of fact. It's scientific proof. That is that males and females are different, not just biologically, but physiologically as well. The medical community treats heart disease and cancers in females differently than it does males. And this is very important to understand, that our gender roles in society, which they do exist, are not purely socio-constructed. That's the fallacy of their logic. They are based on biological expression and differences, okay? So, but because we live in a world where, as I've said before, according to Kennedy, Justice Kennedy, you can, as an American, have a right to make up your own reality. What we've done is we've spent the last 25 years teaching kids that what they feel and what they perceive themselves to be is the reality. And of this, of course, is why so many kids are struggling today, is because this ideology is a lie. And it has lied to young people and messed them up. I was recently reading an article from the Victory Girls. It's a group of women who write on various topics, all different kinds of things. And so they had an article that they just came out, and this basically, let me read from it, and I want to share it with you. It says, Gallup publishes a new poll that purportedly shows nearly 1 in 4 people of Gen Z, meaning people under 30, identify as LGBTQ+. Is this a fad? Is it real? Or the result of ideological capture of the culture? Now, notice what they say. Is this true? Now, it's important to note that for the last, 2,000 years in Western civilization, homosexuality and queerness and even transgenderism and these types of things, body dysmorphia, have been around, and society has been aware of it. And for the last, since we've been tracking it 100 years or so in America, it's always been at exactly 4% of the population. So you'll have 2% or about 2% of men that are gay, about 1.75% of females that are lesbian, and then you'll have the rest just kind of in the queer or transgendered thing. Usually it's been less than 1% of the general population has ever charted as having gender dysphoria or being transgendered. Okay. Well, now 25%. How in the world does that happen? Well, it's called capturing the ideology of the culture. They go on to say, the new freedom to be one's authentic self, loud and proud, also seems to be accompanied by higher rates of dissatisfaction, anxiety, depression, and even suicide and homicide. So here we are with Gen Z, where searching for meaning in life is reduced to a divergent sexual identity. So in other words, what our public education, the media, music, politicians, everything across the board has said, young people, if you want meaning in life, you need to have a divergent sexual identity. In order to have friends and be fulfilled, you have to have a divergent sexual identity. Well, guess what? It's not exactly working out as promised, they write. They go on to write, redefining oneself through sexual or gender labels becomes a quick fix, a way to feel part of something, to stand out in a crowd or escape the overwhelming sense of hopelessness. Ironically, what was once a form of rebellion has become mainstream. In some social circles, being straight or traditionally gendered is now the boring option, the new conformity. It's less about who someone truly is and more about not wanting to be left out. When everyone around you is changing their label or announcing their new identity, staying the same can feel like you're missing the party. Now, notice what they're talking about here is a phenomena in society, but it's all about your identity. They go on to write, no doubt that some of this is the usual self-sorting among the young of every generation, because it is a part of human nature that the young go through a period of separating themselves from their parents. A necessary function of testing the world and themselves outside of the home and culture where they were raised in. To a larger or lesser extent, this includes reaction to contemporary events they find they cannot influence, let alone control. The lost generation of the 20s trying to find meaning after World War I, the greatest generation enduring the Great Depression, World War II, and the realignment of the world stage in the new atomic age. But notice what they say. The identity frenzy is a perfect storm of culture, economic, and existential upheaval. When every traditional structure that once provided meaning has seemingly crumbled, young people are left to grasp at whatever semblance of identity they can find. So, Paul says you have a group of people who are coming in and they're saying having your identity because you believe in Jesus and what he's done for you is not enough. They're saying that you have to adopt all this other stuff. And what we're seeing today is the same thing we've seen in every generation before it. And that is people so desperately wanting to fit in, people so desperately wanting to be a part. And so the Galatians were so desperately wanting to be a part because they're just found this new incredible thing called Jesus. And so they're like, well, maybe we need to become Jewish too, because that will help. Unfortunately, this is a lie that so many people are influenced by. This is under rule number 2, where the world comes in and tries to get you to conform to your faith. That is something that I think is so disturbing. I was just recently asked, and here's something that's kind of controversial and salty, but I was just recently asked about some people that they've been having to do a bunch of stuff out of town. They had some responsibilities they had to take care of. They had a property that they had to fix up and so forth. And so they're taking care of this. And they were just like, well, we've been, streaming a church and trying, the church that we go to, we've been trying, but we feel kind of guilty that we're not going to church. What do you think about that? And I just responded, I said, well, that's an interesting perspective, because when you read the New Testament, you don't ever go to church. What it says is that you are the church. And then so they asked me next, and they said, well, what about that passage in Hebrews, right, where it says we are not to forsake the gathering together, as is the habit of some? And so I said, well, that is a great question. I said, the thing that is really important to understand is, do you ever read that in context? Let me read it for you. Beginning with verse 19, this is Hebrews chapter 10. Since therefore, brothers, we have confidence to enter into the holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way, which he has inaugurated for us through the veil, that is his flesh. And since we have a great priest over the house of God, meaning Jesus, and let us draw with a sincere heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds, not forsaking our own assembling together as the habit of some, but we are encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. Now notice what he's saying there. He's saying he's not chastising people for not attending church. What he's saying is that we need to hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. So whenever you hold fast the confession of your faith without wavering, guess what? You're being the church. Whenever you consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds, you are the church. Going to a building and sitting in a row and listening to music and listening to a message is not a bad thing at all. And for many people, that helps encourage them and lift them up. I love that. But that's actually not being the church. When you look at so many churches out there, the quality of being the church is actually articulated for us in Matthew chapter 25. And he says in Matthew chapter 25, it says that Jesus is on his throne. He is the Lamb, and that people are coming before him. Jesus tells this parable, and that the people are going to be judged, right? And it says, verse 31 of chapter 25, the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him. Then he will sit on the glorious throne. He will gather all the nations together before him, and he is going to separate the goats or the lambs from the goats and the sheep. And here's the criteria. He says, come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the beginning of the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. And then the righteous are going to say, well, when did we ever see that? He says, when you did it to the least of these, my brothers, meaning other people, you did it for me. And then you flip over to Acts chapter 1, and Jesus lays it out. And that's why I tell people, read Luke and read Acts. But in Acts chapter 1, he says, the apostles in verse 6 say, when are you going to restore the kingdom? And Jesus said, it's not for you to know the times. You're going to receive the power of the Holy Spirit when it comes upon you. And he says, in order for you to be my witnesses. So the whole point is to be a witness for Christ. Matthew chapter 28, go and make disciples. And the criteria for being the church is those things. Now, here's something that's really salty, and I want to share this with you, and that is that you can go to many of the largest churches in the Treasure Valley today, and none of them have a food pantry for feeding those who are in need. They don't have a clothing ministry to help clothing people. There's a lot of times they don't even have counseling departments. They outsource it. The only churches that I know of that had the two largest food pantries in the Treasure Valley were Foothills Christian Church and the Vineyard, and they work closely side by side. The food pantry at Foothills Christian Church is still very active, and it's blowing and going, which, by the way, the group of people that tried to blow the church up and hurt it had no regard for Matthew chapter 25 and the ministry of the church to people who are hungry. And I'm curious what they're going to say when they stand before Jesus and they're going to say, well, our petty agenda was more important than the actual calling for the church. Boy, that's a salty thing to say, isn't it? Well, Foothills Christian Church has a clothing pantry, and they have multiple people every Wednesday night coming and getting clothes. They average up to clothing between 50 and 75 people every single week. I mean, that's amazing. For years and years and years, Foothills Christian Church recorded our messages and took it into the prisons and used it as an opportunity for worship. And we had people that would go to the prisons. Now, because of new laws, it's much more difficult to get in there and do that. But Foothills Christian Church has done that. Now, I'm not trying to, throw a feather in the cap of Foothills Christian Church. What I am trying to say is this, is that going to a building and listening to music and listening to a message may inspire you. I think it's awesome. It may be a part of your weekly habits. I love that. But is that actually being the church? Is it really being the church? And so if you're by yourself on a Sunday and you're holding fast to the confession of Christ, if you're trying to stimulate people to love and good deeds, then you're being the church. If you're going up and you're trying to clean up a piece of property or take care of some situation that people need on a Sunday morning, then you're being the church. That you're worshiping God that way. If you, on a Sunday morning, if you're inviting your neighbors over for a brunch and you're just socializing them and you're planting seeds of the gospel, you are being the church. If you get on your motorcycle and you go riding in a riding club on a Sunday so that you can bring guys that are non-believers and you can share with them through your life the seeds of the gospel, you're being the church. My point in all this is that the world wants to conform you and try to tell you this is how to express your faith. The New Testament tells you exactly how to do it. And the more you read it and the more you know it, then the more you can be the church. And when you are focused on rule number 4 and your identity is in Jesus and not what anybody else says, guess what? You will be persecuted for it. I recently did an event at Boise State with Turning Point, speaking to college students, had a great time, hope to do it again. I was on a panel with other community leaders, and it was interesting to me how these other pastors and priests and so forth had a commitment to biblical values, but what I was fascinated with is their sense that everything is really okay. America's still great. And the general consensus was, well, things aren't that bad. Well, I beg to differ. I was kind of the lone voice. Mike Huckabee once said, by all means, if you're not concerned about a political movement that hates everything you stand for and they want to force their agenda on you, your children, and your business, then by all means, don't be involved in politics. Because that's what's happening. And that's what we saw most specifically under the Biden administration was a forcing of it. And the biggest way that we have seen the forcing of this political movement that hates everything that people who put their identity in Christ stand for is in the gender dysphoria and the transgenderism push. And how if you're not affirming it, that somehow you are a transphobe and that you hate kids. This couldn't be farther from the truth. Another way in which you will be persecuted for it is I was just reading an article on debanking, right? And it said this, that in 2020, Bank of America severed ties with the Timothy II Project International. It's a Christian ministry dedicated to training pastors in impoverished communities around the world. The Bank of America claimed the group was involved in a business type it preferred not to serve. So they were debanked by the Bank of America, okay? In 2023, Wells Fargo canceled a line of credit to a Florida gun dealer. In the letter explaining the decision, Wells Fargo said the reasons for this action is banking guidelines excludes lending to certain types of businesses. So you can't do business either as a Timothy 2 project or as a gun. Other individuals and groups targeted by financial institutions include the National Committee for Religious Freedom. It's a Christian nonprofit serving orphan children in Uganda called the Indigenous Advanced Ministries, and Moms for Liberty, a national organization for conservative parents. All of these have been pressured to be debanked. How in the world does this happen? Well, Senator Elizabeth Warren started a non-governmental agency called an NGO, and it was called the Consumer Finance Protection Agency. This group pressures banks to debank conservative groups. They make recommendations and they pressure and they lobby banks to do this. Well, where does their money come from? Well, Doge, being led by Elon Musk, has just pointed out that most of the money that funds these NGOs is coming through programs of the federal government. So the federal government is funding these NGOs who turn around and then enforce their agenda on our institutions. That's how it happens. They force their agenda on schools. They force it on school boards. They force it on banks. They force it on all kinds of institutions. This is starting to smell a little bit like, not saying it is, but the mark of the beast in Revelation, where it says you can't do business unless you carry the mark. I'm not saying it is, but boy, it certainly smells like it. And what it smells like is a giant pile of manure. Well, I guess that's enough ranting and raving. What I want you to understand is that when you think for yourself and when you know where your identity comes from, the world is going to hate you for it, and they're going to go after you for it. But don't let that happen. This is Salty Pastor signing off. And remember, always think for yourself.